Mr. H needs a warm, cozy blanket. My friend's 5-year-old daughter, Hannah, randomly blurted this out as they were shopping online one afternoon, and God set in motion a plan that has given me tremendous hope. Mr. H was my dad. He was able to make 3 trips to my adopted home in Tennessee over the last year before he passed away. Not of the bone cancer his chemo treatments were keeping at bay, with a praise God that none of it was making him sick. Despite months of effort, though, delays, and lack of communication, we couldn't get his general practitioner or cancer doctor to treat him for what was once only swelling in his foot this summer that had escalated into a swollen leg, kidney failure, from efforts that just came too late to treat it, and the subsequent infection that followed. There's more, but that's another story without hope, another time, and another audience for that story. This is about hope, and this is about a blanket. I've been blessed with some incredible friends. When my dad was fighting through a previous illness and more neglect, that literally almost caused him to starve to death. My friends Brandon and Emily had a Vitamix blender sent to him, of all things. My dad was stunned that friends of mine would do something like that for him, to send us something that we could use to help make foods that he could eat at that time when he was trying to get food back inside his body. He was even more shocked when he found out how expensive a Vitamix is from a friend of his. On these trips from Ontario to Tennessee, he got to meet some of the important people in my life, including my longtime friends Lloyd and Mary and their daughter Rachel, and her 3 kids, Eli, Noah, and Hannah. On the middle trip, we attended the Synchronized Fireflies event in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park near my home in Gatlinburg, Tennessee. For this event, it was just Mary, Rachel, Hannah, my dad, and I. I don't know how it happened, but the 2 of them connected and just enjoyed the time with each other. That night, she nicknamed my dad Mr. H, and he began calling her the Firefly Princess after they had a random conversation about the names that royalty are called. They continued to exchange messages, and my dad sent down for them a giant frog birdhouse that he'd made for all the kids and had been able to be a part of the other times that we had got together. It was in the fall that Hannah felt compelled to get my dad a blanket, and Rachel told her to go ahead and pick one out from the online store that they were shopping in from their home in Maryville, Tennessee. I didn't have the heart to tell them at the time that my dad's house was never cooler than 78 degrees, and while the down-filled blanket was really nice, I had no idea when he would ever use it. Dad had the same surprised reaction that one of my friends did something like this, and it made its way to a chair beside his bed. About a month ago, when the kidney pain was worsening and he was fighting to be heard by doctors, he laid down on top of his bed one afternoon and pulled the blanket from the chair to cover himself. It generated just the right amount of warmth to soothe the pain and let him get a couple hours of sleep. He told me over the phone the next day he couldn't believe how well the blanket had worked for him, and he began using it every day to get relief that Tylenol alone just couldn't bring. Not long after, my dad ended up admitted to the hospital. So much more went wrong that week, but one of the worst was no one speaking to me first before putting him on pain meds so strong he couldn't stay conscious enough to speak, taking away my last chance to speak to him. When I made it to the house from Tennessee, I searched frantically for the power of attorney and the blanket to take up to the hospital with me. When I was searching for the power of attorney, instead of being in the drawer where it was supposed to be, were the pictures Hannah had drawn and colored to send with the blanket. My dad had put them in the place reserved for his most important papers. The blanket, I soon found, was covering him at the hospital. While it was hopefully providing him some comfort by the end of the worst day of my life, it was going to give me some comfort as well, and then the most important twist in the story would come. I tried to talk to him off and on throughout the day, and there were times he would stay sort of alert for a few moments, but it was hard to know what he was hearing and understanding. He could tell me where the pain was and was desperate for a drink of water, but he couldn't stay alert long enough to suck any from the straw. His condition was deteriorating while his doctor and nurses were sidestepping, telling me he was dying after his swelling had been ignored for months and his kidneys were failing. I was trying desperately to talk to him. I was desperate to know for certain he knew I was at his side, and while I fought to keep his attention, I brought up the blanket. I said, "Do you remember Hannah, Dad? I see you brought the blanket with you. Do you remember Hannah?" And Dad, just trying to get him to keep his eyes open long enough to stay with me. And then finally, I thought he said the word yes, but I wasn't so sure. And I said to him, "Do you remember the Firefly Princess, Dad?" I tried not to sob when he actually smiled. Not the kind of smile where you're just desperate to see what you want to see and you're not sure if you saw it or not, but a real smile long enough to see and know that he remembered Hannah, he remembered the blanket, he remembered me. Praise God he knew I was there. But here's the extra twist. While Hannah just randomly decided my dad needed that blanket, another friend in Maryville who sews, Catherine, had similar ideas around the same time. She told me on the phone this week that while she only met my dad once on one of our 3 trips, she felt like God wanted her to make my dad a blanket. Her and her husband Patrick were leading a youth retreat with the church and were among several people who regularly prayed for my dad. Word got to them at the retreat that my dad had died early that morning. Catherine gently cried as she told me that she had a lot of quiet time during the retreat to just think and pray, and that she asked God for mercy for not forcing into their hectic schedule the time it would take to make that blanket. She felt like she let God and my father down. I was able to tell her there was no need to feel bad. God had taken care of it. While I've shared the gospel with my dad and tried to have conversations about it with him, I've never been clear what he truly believed. He was raised Lutheran, taught Sunday school in the United Church in Canada, and I remember how dismissive I was to religion at the time as a teenager when he told me his last act as a parent needed to be getting me confirmed in a church. And I just wasn't interested. I found in a dresser drawer a couple nights ago a worn book of liturgy from the Lutheran church he attended as a kid. There was also an old Bible, his infant baptism record, and record of his confirmation as a teenager into the Lutheran church. Without specific clarity from him, I've been worried for my dad's soul. And while this blanket brought physical and emotional comfort to my dad, it brought some to me as well, because as Catherine pointed out, that through this blanket, there's little question God had his hand on my father. Things were happening outside of our control. God was making sure that his will would be done. She may not have gotten to make him that blanket, but she was instrumental in pulling together the pieces and giving me hope that God really did save my father. This whole situation has been a reminder that God has really given me some incredible friends, and I wish there was a way to acknowledge everyone who's called, taken calls, listened, advised, wept, and most importantly, prayed for my father and loved him and I through this journey. Their words, thoughts, and actions have just done so much for us both. It sounds terrible at first, but I can't stand the sight of this blanket. It's tied too tightly to that hospital bed where I watched my father die. It's still out there in his van in a bag labeled personal effects. I've asked Rachel if she will take it back and keep it safe until Hannah's old enough to understand what she did for my father as the Firefly Princess, and what she and Catherine did for my hope in Jesus Christ.